So one of the things that I started to allude to yesterday is that we have situations where we are going to have databases and data and files and different type of data passed back and forth into our program, possibly out of our, and definitely out of our program. When we start creating APIs, the purpose of an API is to allow a client to call our API program for us to accept the data that they're sending to us and process that data, and then make a response back to them. Okay, we're going to do all that. We're going to talk about all of the important pieces of that puzzle, but basically, we're going to have a request from the client, and we're going to respond with a response. Okay, now if you think about it, how many different systems are out there? There's like .NET, there's Python, there's Java, there's XML files, there's CSV files, there's JSON files, there's all these different types of data that will come into us. We want to be able to accept that information coming into us. We don't want to restrict anything, but we need to be able to turn that information into something that's useful in our Java program. And Java, as an object-oriented language, needs to have Java objects. We don't run necessarily on file formats that are not familiar. But what we do is we create objects that can, and then we pull that data into the Java object, and then we have the ability for our Java program to manipulate it or read it or do whatever it needs to do to then go ahead and not only do the logic, but also format some type of a response. So let's do this here. Let's say that we have, let's do a CSV file. That's a comma separated file. And let's take a look at what one of those looks like here. We've seen these on spreadsheets, right? We're kind of familiar with, everyone's familiar with those, I think. So, all right, so here's an example of a CSV file, right? It's information separated by commas, and that's how this file structure is. It's a CSV file, okay? But we don't use CSV files in data processing in a Java program. So if this is coming into me, this is the format, what I need to do is I need to map it to a Java object. Now, a Java object can be something that's referred to as a bean or possibly a POJO. Plain old Java object is what a POJO is. And a plain old Java object would be an example of some of the classes that we started creating when we talked about object-oriented and inheritance and those types of things. A plain old Java file would have variables, and then it has methods, right? But it has methods for the purpose of actually allowing us to handle those variables in a way that we can use this as a data model, okay? So we have instant variables, we have constructors, and we might have, and then we could have getters and setters. We might have a two-string method, right? Just a general POJO, and oftentimes referred to as a bean, because when we start talking about Spring is made up of object files that are referred to as beans, okay? So that's a terminology that you'll hear. For right now, just understand that a plain old Java object, a POJO, is going to have instance variables, constructor, getter, and setters, and a two-string, okay? So we can understand what the data is that's coming into us and the format that it's coming into. In other words, if I look at this CSV file, I can see that the top line, those things kind of look like a spreadsheet, right? Those might be the column titles in a spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet that we're familiar with, seeing these spreadsheets, if you notice we have make, model, year, color, displacement, horsepower, and weight as what appear to be titles, right? And then if I go back to the CSV file that we were looking at, that's what it looks in its raw form, right? This would be a CSV file in the raw form, and then when we open that up with whatever our tool might be to show the spreadsheets, be it Google or be it Microsoft, we would see it in its form that we were just looking at. But in the background, this is what would be sent to us. Okay. Use your imagination here and some creativity to think, how might we create a Java object that would allow us to map the data from the CSV file into the Java object? All right, let's go back to the code here in our miscellaneous projects. And, okay, and I know that I'm going to have instance variables, as Janina was saying, of make, model, year, color. Let's start with those as string. So I'm just going to start building this POJO, or this plain old Java object. Make, model, year, color will be the first ones. Then these last ones I'm going to create as ints, displacement, horsepower, and weight. Okay, so sticking here with my motorcycle object, plain old Java object, I'm not done yet. I've got my instance variables, so if anyone can think of what some of the other things we've been doing when we create these files. Keith? Constructor, right? Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do command new. I'm going to look for a constructor. It's going to give me the option to include a constructor that would take every one of these items. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So it automatically creates that. And I'm also going to say I want to allow this to have a default constructor. So I'm going to do command N for generate. And once again, I'll hit constructor, but this time I'll say select none of those. Now I have a default constructor, and I have a constructor with all of the variables overridden. I have an overridden constructor and I have a default constructor. And what I said overridden, and I meant to say overloaded, right? Overloaded means it has has the same name but different signature. Okay, who else can tell me what we normally do with these plain old Java objects at this point? Tim?
Getters and setters.
Getters and setters make sense. Same thing. We're going to let IntelliJ do the work for us. I'll select all, and there's the getters and setters. And one last thing that we've been adding over the last couple days would be the toString method. I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. Now, if everyone would please go to, let's see, at this point we have the model class set up in our model package. The motorcycle class is there. This is going to start to become common for us as well. We're going to have, right now we've been creating one package and putting all the files that we need into that package. Going forward, we're going to start to see that certain files will be written with certain types of functionality in mind. And we're going to have a model class, a model package where we'll have these POJOs. We're going to have a service package where we might have all of this data, the business processing in the service layer. We're going to have a controller layer. So we're going to start doing a little bit more of this as opposed to keeping one package with all of the files that we're using in it. So that's where we're headed here with this. That's why we have the POJO, the motorcycle POJO, in the model package. Now what I'd like to ask everyone to do is open up the POM XML file. And I believe everyone should look something similar to this. Not a lot of entries in our POM XML file right now. Simply the properties of Maven compiler source 1.8. If you remember right, in the pre-work or the first couple of days of class, we added this into the POM file, and that's what tells our program to go ahead and use Java 8. Okay? And we don't have a section in our POM XML yet for dependencies. We're going to add this dependency. So I'd like everyone to do the greater than bracket and start to type dependencies. It should pop up. You can select it. And notice it puts the opening and closing tags. The XML is usually referred to as a tag. And the closing one would have the / after the tag. And simply what I'm doing here is I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and I'm going to want to put additional dependencies in here because the structure of Maven and the structure of these POM files will now tell Maven to go get the dependencies for what we're asking for. Now, let's go back here, and now you can see that the dependency is set up for me to choose. I'm going to copy that, go back to my POM file, and under the dependencies setup here, I'm going to add that. Okay. Now, one thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to change that version from 4.0 to 4.4. Okay, now if you notice down at the bottom here, you've probably seen this pop up before, but we've got our Maven projects need to be imported. Now, some people have chosen the enable auto import, and you won't see that any longer. I like to leave it in manual here so I can see what is going to be brought into my program, but I am going to go ahead and implement those changes, import those changes. It'll run in the background briefly. Now, if I go back to my external libraries, remember when we looked at this before, we only saw the 1.8 libraries, right? Now look at what's been added. Now we have a bunch of things, right? That all came in because of this entry. That is Maven managing our dependencies for us. What I would like to do next is start to code out some of that and explain how we're using this. Now, the intention of these next 3 coding exercises that we're going to go through is not necessarily for us to dive into every individual piece of what's going on with OpenSUV. It's to understand that this library is available for us to be able to utilize with minimal amount of knowledge of how it works. We can always dive in to find out more if you want, or if there's a problem with what you're getting back out of it, that could be a time for that. But we want to have these libraries that can allow us to do this mapping with minimum amount of work for us. Okay, I had a package called File Structure Mapping, whatever your package was for the file structure discussions that we started where we put the model. You should have one path that leads where there's a package that has the motorcycle class in the model folder. And then if you could, I'd like you to create another folder in that same structure called CSV. Okay, and in there I'm going to go ahead and create a Java class called app open CSV. Let's just take a look at the first part of what's going on at the top of this file here. Okay, so we have this large line here. Okay, so in our main class, we've got a try-catch block. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I want to draw your attention up there to line number 16, okay? This is nothing new that we haven't seen, at least as of yesterday, okay? So this is another opportunity for us to get familiar with array lists. And I also remember that one of our groups, I think it was the team on the right-hand side over here, had mentioned about using an array list, I should say, in the context of doing this file transfer and these mappings. So here up at the top, we're going to create a list of motorcycles. Makes sense, right? And we're going to call it bikes. And that build out line here says new CSV to bean builder. of motorcycles, and then it's sending in a file reader. Then it has some other things out here that may not be familiar to us, right? When we go ahead and actually create the array list, what we're really looking to do is read from the CSV file, which is coming into us, and put that data into an array list, okay? And how will we import that data into the array list? And here's the CSV file that we're going to read, right? Motorcycles CSV. Notice how this says file reader here. So we're saying here we can intuitively say we're going to read that file, okay? And that file is going to be a CSV file. But then we're going to want to take the information that's in that file and put it into an array list, right? So if I go back to the spreadsheet that we were looking at earlier, so the CSV file really looks like this when we put it in Excel or Google Docs. So if you notice, each line has a meaning, right? So how would we say that we might, how are we planning to represent each one of these lines? Because if we're going to create a list of something, we're going to create multiple objects in an array list. So what have we modeled those objects to be? Well, when we create the array list, right, we have to use a data type. Remember, we have those brackets, which if we don't tell it what data type, it'll take any data type. So we created the array list to take in some type of object. And what is that object? Motorcycle. Exactly. So it's fair enough to say that each one of these lines represents a motorcycle. And it's each one of those objects that we want to put into an array list. The CSV file comes into us. It's got line by line by line of data, 3 lines here. Well, let's say it's got 30,000 lines, right? So we want to pull all that data into a Java object so we can process it. So that's why we created the POJO, the Java object, and we said that that Java object would have variable names of make, model, year, color, displacement, horsepower, and weight. So now we're already setting up the mapping so that if OpenCSV in the background has a whole bunch of code to say, it's smart enough to say that that make, that first item that comes in could map to here, and the model could map to here, and we go all the way down the line. Now we've got OpenCSV doing the mapping for us. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the reason we want to put this into an array list is because OpenCSV needs to, for us to give its methods what it needs to do that process. So by creating the objects, we're going to put that into an array list, and that's going to help us later on down the road. But in the meantime, let's take a look at this here. So to prove out what I was saying, we created an array list and we defined it to be of type motorcycle, right? And then the new CSV down there, that's saying that we are going to do something with this file. And notice that over here, this with type says it's going to be of a motorcycle type. So now that's the OpenCSV needing to know what's our model. Well, we're telling it it's motorcycle. And then over here, it's going to build and it's going to parse. It's actually going to parse and then build. But that is the format that we need to use to allow OpenCSV to find that file and then build this array and then create this array for us. Now, if I was to jump to the with type method, I will see that that is going to be found here. It's in the CSV to Bean Builder class, which is part of my OpenCSV dependencies. Okay, so what we end up with here is a list of motorcycles after all of that work is done in the background. And here we have if we put together a for loop and go in and pull out each one of those individual items, we are going to see that that list of that bike, the list called bikes, is going to print out motorcycle information. And here what we're saying is let's go get each of the items that are important. Okay. So notice here that what we did was we ended up with the 3 entries that we have in the motorcycle CSV, and we now have those in a list object. So now they are successfully placed into a Java object that we can utilize. And what we did is we just printed out each of the pieces for 1, 2, and 3 objects in the list that were brought in from the motorcycle CSV, which has the 1, 2, 3 files. So we've just accomplished with the open source, or with the open CSV, the conversion from the CSV file into the Java object. Okay, so now let's do the opposite side of it, where we want to take this object that we now have and actually output that to a CSV file. OpenCSV will also do that for us, and that's what this code is for down here. Okay, notice in the earlier code we had a file reader that was associated with the motorcycle CSV file that we were taking in. We used OpenCSV to say, okay, the CSV file that we're going to act upon needs to have a model that's associated with it, and we said that would be the motorcycle class file. That gave us our Java POJO, so that it could then map those fields from the CSV file into the Java object. And then this building and parsing are part of its OpenCSV work that does to go through, parse the file, and move it into the Java object. And down here, we have a little bit of a different situation. Now we're using some other classes that we haven't seen yet, but these are Java provided. The writer makes sense because we want to write a file. And then we have so first we have the file writer, and we're going to actually create a new file called new moto file CSV. And we have the stateful bean to CSV, right? So what we did up top is we created the writer object that will create this file for us, and then we're sending that into the stateful bean to CSV builder. And again, it has a method on the outside of it here that says it's going to build, and basically we need to then follow this method and say we want to build the bikes list into a CSV file. And if all goes well, after we're done with that, we should see that new moto file CSV, which we now have on our file path here, and that looks like this. Okay, so in this one program we did both. We read in the file and we also sent out the file. Is everyone okay with that? Okay.